I'd like to show you now an early experiment of Scott Kelso's that informed his later work on coordination in locomotion and coordination among the hands and in many other domains. This was a very simple experiment, but very profound in some respects. What you see on the slide are detailed descriptions of both the experimental conditions and the experimental results. So I'm going to walk you through this because it doesn't explain itself clearly. In these experiments, subjects sat with their two fingers on home keys like this, and then at the signal they had to move one finger or two fingers to targets which were either nearby and big or far away and little. So in a given trial, they might be moving, for example, two fingers to nearby targets or one finger to a distant target. And in each case, they recorded the amount of time needed from the ringing of the bell to the landing of the finger on the target. Now, that time is composed of two parts. There's a reaction time, which is about 200 milliseconds and is constant across all the conditions. And then there's the time to flight, the flight time from lifting off to landing. And I'm going to simplify these figures here because there's a very simple underlying pattern. We're going to walk through the conditions which are listed from top to bottom, each row being one experimental condition. So on the first row there, you can see that the right hand finger is going to the distant small target only. And that takes about 160 milliseconds. In the row 2, the left-hand target is going to the small distant target, and that also takes about 160 milliseconds. In row 3, the left-hand target is going to the nearby big target, and that's faster, it takes less time. It's easier to hit, it's bigger. So that takes actually about half the time, about 80 milliseconds. This is a carefully calibrated experiment. And doing the same thing on the right-hand side in row 4 also takes 80 milliseconds. So now we've got some basic expectations. In row 5, we move two fingers to the nearby targets, and it also takes about 80 milliseconds. So it doesn't really matter whether we're moving one finger or two fingers. It takes about 80 milliseconds either way to get to the nearby large targets. The next row down shows the hands moving to the two distant targets, and this takes about 160 milliseconds. So far, so good. Doesn't seem to make much difference whether we move one hand or two hands, and the distant targets take twice as long as the nearby targets. The only interesting conditions are the two lower ones, in which we combine a distant target and a nearby easy target. In the second last row, the left hand goes to a distant target, the right hand goes to a nearby target. In the last row, the left hand goes to the near target, the right hand goes to the distant target. And the very simple result is that in such cases, both hands take 160 milliseconds. So the nearby targets require 80 milliseconds and the distant targets require 160 milliseconds. But when we have one nearby and one distant target, both hands need about 160 milliseconds. The hands are not independent of each other. What you do with one hand greatly affects what you do with the other. They work together in synergy. Here's some plots of the movement. At the top you see the movement of the two hands shown there. The upper trace shows movement to the difficult target, lower trace movement to the easy target. The middle plot shows the speed or velocity, and the lower plot shows the acceleration. And in each case, you can clearly see that these hands are bound together. They reach their velocity peaks at the same time. The acceleration profiles are closely linked. So what this shows is that there were never two separate hands to be controlled independently of one another. They become bound together in the context of the task. So that the role of the brain here is not to control like a puppeteer. As Scott says, the brain produces simultaneity of action, not by controlling each limb independently, but by organizing functional groupings of muscles that are constrained to act as a single unit. And the function in this case is given by the task. You are familiar with something like this. As a kid, you probably learned to pat your tummy and tap your head at the same time. Well, I encourage you now in lecture to rub your tummy and pat your head. Okay, we can all do this, so in some sense the hands are independent. But now if you try to speed up the tummy, what you find is the head speeds up as well. You speed up one hand, the other one speeds up. They're not independent of each other. Anyone who's ever tried to drum a polyrhythm, like 2 against 3, here that is to tap out a 1, 2, 1, 2 with one hand and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 with the other, will know that this is a little bit difficult. You can actually practice this at home. I'll show you how to do 2 against 3. If you repeat the phrase, nice cup of tea, nice cup of tea, nice cup of tea, nice cup of tea, it's not too difficult. What that does is it brings that pattern of 2 and that pattern of 3 into a single overall form given by the phrase. And if you're feeling really ambitious, you can try 3 against 4, which is eat your goddamn spinach. Eat your goddamn spinach. Okay, enough of the drumming. Time to think. In the 1960s and 1970s, a common term used to describe the organization of action was a motor program. This is at a time when the computational theory was the only game in town, and so the brain was only understood as a program, as a computer. I want to suggest to you that this is very misleading. In a computer program, what we have is a central executive that tells subservient parts what they're to do. There's an obvious chain of command from the CPU to the periphery. Now, there might be some role for feedback, but clearly the roles of controller and controlled are quite separate. So the use of this program metaphor, the use of this computational metaphor, seems to introduce a fundamental divide, specifically between the brain and the body, that what we observe does not support. Even when we look within the brain, we do not see the basis for a single chain of command. If you want to sum up 50 years of brain research, anatomy and physiology, in one slide, it's this. We used to think of the brain as having pathways where things went from one end to the other, inputs and outputs. We now know everything in the brain is massively connected to everything else. It's all recurrently connected with lots of feedback loops everywhere. It doesn't look like a serial programmer of any sort. So there's a lot to be learned from the study of movement.